What are the steps to creating a map of content? Bogdan asked. There are a few steps, and I want to talk about that because that's really important. And how did I miss this? Uh, folders. Folders are top down. So like if you always had to go to the home note before you did anything, if you had to do that, that would be rigid. And it would be a top down, it is a top down way of thinking. We're working from a convergent perspective, and we're going into our existing knowledge. With links, with these link-based apps like Obsidian and Roam, we now, and before that, the archive, which is kind of the gold standard, in my opinion, by the guys at the Zettelkasten.de forum, because that's like the most future-proof. It's very simple. It's the Luddite version of knowledge management, but it's always there for you. So I want to give a shout out to those guys and the archive. But because of links, now we can do bottom up thinking. Bottom up, allow ideas to just form, and then naturally, organically, we make these connections. Okay, so we have top down thinking, we have bottom up thinking, and then with maps of content, we have the option to do this sort of middle out thinking. And the best way that I talk about this right now is that, where do I spend my time when I'm in my note library? And I have to say the biggest revelation for my thinking has been spending most of my time in a map. And I'll throw notes in there. So I'll throw all these notes, I'll throw them in a new map, and then I'm in colliding phase. And because of that, I say it's ideation acceleration. Think of the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. It is smashing, subatomic atomic particles together. Some of them merge to form a new note, so to speak. Others fall away, and these are these discarded notes. But what's happening with those type of collisions is massive, massive work, massive progress. And I just find that this is the best way to go to get that done at the fastest rate, at the funnest rate, at the rate that has the most flow. So if we go back to what are the steps to creating a map of content, there are two ways. You allow ideas to emerge naturally, and then eventually you get to the point where you want to start, I call it the mental squeeze point. You get to this mental squeeze point where you're about to become overwhelmed by whatever notes that you're working with, and you need a way to work with them where you can offload the cognitive burden. And this is perfect because I really want to add, I'm going to come back to this note, but right now I just want to make sure I get chunking in here, because mental squeeze point and chunking are tightly related. And why not? Let's just see what happens here. Let's publish this change, and then eventually we'll check it out in a couple minutes on the Obsidian published feature, which is just so cool. The point being, though, is when you're in your notes, as you start to reach the mental squeeze point, that's when you create a map of content. Or you know what you want to talk about already. You have a preconceived idea, right? We want to get away from that all the time, but there are still times where we think, hey, this is exactly what I want to talk about. Then I'll go in here and I'll make a new one from the start. And I'm just trying to think of something I'm going to be doing in the workshop coming up is my Cosmos MOC, where I force myself to watch I'm joking force, but where I rewatch the Carl Sagan Cosmos series and the new one, and try to pull out those wow moments that really have spoken to me and inspired me in that sense of awe and wonder. And so I already know what I want to work on. So I'm going to start with an MOC, and then just each episode will kind of be a heading, and I'll put ideas underneath that, and then they'll start pushing out to other places. So the short answer is the steps are basically, you just create a new note and then you call it whatever you want. But how you get there is usually you start from a bottom up sense of, oh, I don't want to forget what I'm talking about. Let me make a new map of content. Or you start from the top down and you say, okay, I'm just starting with this idea. I know what the idea is. Let me start compiling notes here. So those are the two ways that you can kind of approach it. Okay. Was this inspired by the Dewey Decimal System? There is some inspiration here, actually, especially like these numbers here. Here's what I like about the Dewey Decimal System. It's just that there are about 10 or so major categories, like the zeros. Here, let's just kind of dive into it. So in this interest map of content, this is sort of my catch-all of maps I'm interested in, of topics I'm interested in. So like in this LYT Kit, these are some other maps. Some of these haven't really been created even in my main library, but I want them to be created at some point. What's a good example of that? Greco-Roman map of content, just some of those cultural elements. I eventually want to kind of compile them here. But if we look at what's happening, this is the Dewey Decimal System, just modified, and only at the high level. So MV, what I'm not doing is I don't want to get into decimals. This is a personal aesthetic preference. There's no reason not to, other than when you start to get into decimals with your numbering over here, you just start to add a rigid structure that may not be necessary. I think at that point it gets a little less fluid. So why use numbers at all? Well, you don't have to. The reason that I'm using some numbers for these home maps is just so that they sort. So they sort to the top, and they're always here. I can always find them, and that gives me a little bit of comfort as I use my knowledge. But there's nothing special about these numberings. I use 3 digits because this gives me some flexibility. So everything starts with a 0 and it can sort properly. And then I can add, like, in between goals and personal knowledge management, I added, this one that was in between. There's nothing special about it at all. And then to answer your question more directly, in this interest map of content, which MV, if you just go to the note here, you can read a little bit more about using the Dewey Decimal System. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Just real fast though, I'm just curious if that chunky note made it. I'm trying to think the best way. What did I just link to? Mental squeeze point. One thing that Publish doesn't have yet, but will, is search. So until that shows up, mental squeeze point. Let's talk about the MOCs intro, mental squeeze point, chunking. It doesn't exist yet. So when you publish, it takes about 10 minutes, is what I found, for those changes to take place. Next question. Can the 5 levels, emergence levels, be constructed with folders and links? Yeah. Well, so Frank asked this. I would construct them with notes and links. And that's what I've done here. I'm not saying you can't use folders, but there is some rigidity that comes into it. And it does mean that you'll be doing a lot more twirl downs. I tried to avoid the twirls because this is buried information. In fact, that should jump in there. But this is buried information. Every time I have to twirl into something. And I only have this habits example as a space just for the LYT Kit. But in reality, I wouldn't have this folder because I would just use a map of content. But you might find, for whatever reason, some desire to use this. I think the spaces, a good time to use that would be for, my business or whatever. And then you can kind of make sure that your business specific work that isn't sort of idea and interrelated, you can have a special place for that. But the whole idea here is to use fewer folders now that we have the power of the link. And the great folder rebellion is upon us, and many people went away from folders completely. I believe that folders still have a place, but it's about the amount that we use, and it's about kind of lopping off a 0. So if you had 100 folders, let's take it down to like 10 folders. Then we're in the better range of proper use, in my opinion. All right, let's keep going. My impression is that a strong naming system pattern is necessary to maintain the whole thing, living and fluid, isn't it? Would it be possible to have some hints? Sure. I mean, this kind of, I'll try to keep it brief. A strong naming system, is it key? Well, no, but there's a tendency to go in that direction. And that's, if we go back, remember what you're doing is you're just making a Zettelkasten when you work with links, because each note can then just link to other notes. And if they're atomic in size, if they're written in your own words, then sure, they're even more like a Zettelkasten. But when I use that term, I just kind of mean generally we're talking about small notes that are linking to other notes. That's really all that matters. When you get into the maps of content, that helps you chunk information and helps it easier to recall and retrieve this information. Let's go back to your question, so I'm answering it completely. Is it necessary to maintain the whole thing? And here's the beauty. It's not necessary to maintain. Once you create it, like up until yesterday, I was working on a new TV show that's coming out on NBC called Connecting. So that means that I didn't have much time to be in my actual note library. And that's the beauty of the maps, is that I come back and already, like, I'm off to the races. When I come back to my knowledge management, I'm already jogging. Like, I'm already in it. And so, how this works is when you make a new map, what my best practice is that you relate it, you connect it to, somehow back to a home map. And a good example of this is in mindsets. And then if we go to habits, so this whole habits note, what did I do with this note? Because it's a map of content, I like to have a link at the top. So I just said, habits is what home map does habits relate to? Let me connect that. And that's what I did. So I connected habits to mindsets. And then mindsets, if I click this breadcrumb, takes me back to the home note. So let's look at the graphic. What's happening here? This is exactly sort of what's happening. So habits right here is a map of content I created. It's a new map, but I want to kind of, be able to find it quickly. So I made sure that there's a link that exists within mindsets. So in this way, we've chunked information, but we also allow for easy information to flow, and we can fly through the note library. So that's not the definitive answer, but hopefully that gives you some hints like you asked. Do you think you need to use a Zettelkasten ID? Great question, Steve. I don't think I need to. I think there are places to definitely use it. And I think your example here is a perfect place to use it. So the question is, when do you want to track information chronologically? And so I can think of, let me make this even bigger for people looking on their screens. When would I want to do that? For me, it would be meetings. We can consider this a meeting, like personal tracking. Anything that's tracking logging is a perfect opportunity to timestamp. And why not use a Zettelkasten ID? Or, maybe you say that you don't really need that level of depth. That's, an aesthetic purpose, and to a large degree, it's an aesthetic purpose. I understand that these Zettelkasten IDs will never change. And that was sort of the beauty of them early on, like in the archive. Now with Roam and with Obsidian, links, like file names auto update. So if I were to change the home note and just add some nonsense to the end of it, then I can see that it was updated immediately as a backlink in all those files. So I'll just take that back. That kind of makes this specific timestamp as a unique ID less valuable to me, because I believe that this auto updating file name is the new standard. I expect it. I feel comfortable in its future proofness. But if you don't, then certainly use this for all of your notes. If we do feel comfortable, then it goes to when do we want to track something chronologically, and anything like that is a perfect place to add, some sort of timestamp, something like that. Okay, let's see. And 42. Okay, I'll try to fly through a little bit faster. Let's see. Do you consider it appropriate to describe in the homepage and MOC not only the relationships between entities, but also the purpose of their existence, so that you can periodically check the clocks? Describe it in the home notes, not only the relationship, the purpose of their existence. Yeah, I think so. I would say, like, in the home note, this is me describing the purpose of this map of content at the top. So I'll try to have something like that. Let's see what I did in mindsets. I want to, so it's kind of like a launch pad into like where I want to dial in my focus. Concepts. Well, concepts is sort of its own thing. Writings. Okay, so here's that purpose again. This is where you find your writings and creations of all flavors. So am I answering? I think I'm answering the purpose of their existence. So yeah, anywhere I can, I will absolutely add that information, because that's future-proofing. I think what you're getting at is that how can we future-proof this for ourselves? So when we come back, however years later to this note, do we remember why we're using it? So yeah, I try to absolutely future-proof in that way. How long does it take for someone to develop all 5 levels? Well, that's a great question. And I'll just go back to starting like this. Cut that out. So just make a home note. You should have level 5 right now. It just shouldn't be unearned structure. That's the real key is, and I have to say this for a lot of people like myself who have a tendency to want to over organize. And I imagine many of us, if we're on this call, are similar in that boat. So that's my biggest warning with the LYT Kit. When you look at these 5 levels, everyone just wants to create, this structure at the top, but it's unearned. It's unearned until you have enough stuff bubbling up, and you feel mental squeeze points, and then you're like, oh, okay, I do need to create a new note, or excuse me, a new map of content. There is an exception to this, because we all weren't born yesterday. So I think I made note of this. Okay, so if we can dial into this little section here, since you weren't born yesterday, you may already have some ideas for home maps, right? I mean, you've already done Emergence. It might just not exist in your actualized notes. So, you can attempt to add, a couple home maps at the start. Just be aware be very afraid of over-structuring too soon. Like, structure needs to be earned. But yeah, I encourage you to start with at least one. Start with your home note and put at least one map of content in there and just get the sense of things. I mean, these are really some strange categories if you think about it. It's not as simple as like, physical. It could be, or projects, and that could be too. I actually have projects down here. The point being, though, is these are the categories that have earned a place in my dashboard. And so, you just want to make sure that it's earned over time. Frank asked, does one start with Emergence or Emergence 1? Does one start with Emergence 5? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, this is the great question. Do we start with bottom up or top down? Until recently, you had to start with top down. Folder-based file systems on the Mac and Windows basically forced us to always be thinking about structure first. But now we have the fluidity to think wherever we want to. And I roll out of bed this morning, and maybe I talk to somebody. I was talking with Steve about oil and water. Hey, that's a cool concept. Let's roll with that. and that's emergence level 1. Or, you know, we're talking about concepts, some sort of like high level concept. And I kind of want to think of it from my concept map. So I'll start in the map and then I'll be like, how can I work in this new one? How can I work in chunking? Where should I put chunking? You know, something like that. So you can go in either direction. How do you use tags? I'm torn between using, first of all, like tags is always that area that's a tricky one. So let's see where we go here. I'm torn between using general tags. I'm going to make this even bigger for everyone. On a note in order to easily find them in the future, but also concerned that general tag might be related to hundreds of notes. Yeah, this is an extremely valid concern. It's, I think, and the real concern with tags is over tagging, because every time that you tag something, you do dilute the value, because instead of having 100 notes with a tag, if you have like 1,000 and then if you search that tag, your results are pretty muddy. Now, I mean, there are workarounds, and a good example of that, if, you know, I'm just trying to think of a good example. If I search source, let me collapse results. So I have a certain amount of notes. Let me make this a little bit easier to look at. But if I add a second one, like commentary, then that list goes down. So, I mean, there is a way to very easily to kind of filter by using more tags and everything. The only thing that, so I think they're an extremely powerful tool. And the way to look at them is, remember I said earlier, a link is just a relationship by another name. Tag is a relationship by another name. It's just a weaker relationship, right? You're just kind of saying like, hey, these two notes they have the same hobby that they're interested in. Whereas a link is saying they are related, like they're blood relative, essentially. So I think, yeah, the tags are really valuable. The only thing is, you can get in the trouble of over tagging. Just like, hey, what could this possibly relate to? So it's important to define how you want to tag, like descriptor tags. In my home note, I try to show I show right here my most important ones. And then if we jump into a note like writings, I show other ones that I can use. So when in doubt, I use that top-down fluid home note to direct me on how should I be tagging my writings. I'm like, okay, yeah, this is a journal. What else is it? Eventually I published something. Well, journal and output wouldn't really go together, but journal, maybe it's a letter too. Maybe it's a letter I wrote to somebody personally. So then these two go together. But this allows me to understand these home maps. What tags have I kind of validated I want to be using? You can go crazy with descriptor tags, so just be careful, because you don't want to make them less useful by over tagging everything. This one. Is this started with a bottom-up approach or a top-down? Greg asks. So the LYT Kit started, my notes started from, it really just informed each other over time, because, originally it was in Evernote, and then I went plain text, NV, notational velocity, into the archive, into now Obsidian. And so it's had a mixture of sort of like top-down, like notebooks thinking, but over time it's become more bottom-up. But as these notes start to connect, then the top-down starts to push back. And so now there's this nice hierarchical structure, which is like sometimes these notes are more dominant than these notes, but it changes. It has that fluidity to it, but there's still structure. In my mind, I picture an amoeba, sort of how it can kind of like expand and change its shape. Hopefully that answers it. There's not a direct way it was started. So I covered the idea behind the numbering. which is, it's fairly arbitrary, but for me, it just helps for sorting. And I covered why 3 digits. I just have to say it again, don't overnumber. I mean, there's such the habit to like overstructure, overnumber, and it's really I think my opinion is the wrong way to look at the issue. In your use case, how many folders are too many? 10. No, there's no like number, but that being said, I think, again, it's about whatever you're used to remove a 0. So if you're used to 100, take it closer to 10, and then you're in the right ballpark. If you had 1,000, well, hey, just take it down to 100 and you'll be good. How many tags are too many? I wouldn't look at it that way, because they allow you some fluidness when you are, thinking about how things are connected. So it's okay to have just a few that are around. For some reason, you decided there was value. So I'm not too worried about having too many tags. Okay, different communities that talk about Zettelkasten, gardens, evergreen, notes, vaults, all that good stuff. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not a part of all of the communities, but the communities that I've used the most have been the Zettelkasten.de forums, but most recently has been the Obsidian Discord and the Obsidian forum. By far, those have been my most trafficked lately. Do I keep previous versions of MOCs in case I want to go back? I keep previous versions of outputs. So not necessarily MOCs, because in my opinion, the MOCs should naturally be evolving, and I'm okay with that. But let's see if there's a good example of, sure if I linked back to it. So, well, without showing too much, this is another library of mine. Try to hide this a little bit. But if you see my PKM story, and in the links section, let me close this. So I have some metadata at the top. I didn't prepare this, so let's see. But I gave it a B01. That means it's a different version for me. And I decided to keep my A01. So I'll just append something simple like that. I picked that up from the Zettelkasten.de forum years ago. And I'm not saying it's the best method, but it's just something that kind of works for me. So every new letter denotes a new kind of substantial iteration of that. And if I want to keep the old one, I can just do something like this. And you can do the same thing for a map of content in your case. If you wanted to keep the old one for whatever reason, yeah, just give it a little append name or number. How necessary is it to add numbers before file names in maps of content, specifically for the major ones found in the home note? It's not necessary at all. It's just a personal preference. I like how if I use the file explorer, they can sort to the top, because I always just sort by file name A to Z, but it's totally not necessary. If you break a note into 2 pieces or subnotes, do you keep the original note 2 as separate, or do you edit that too? I won't keep the original note because 90% of the time, 95% of the time, I won't keep the original note, because that's the beauty of evergreen note making, is that I can keep aspects of the note. I'm trying to think of a good example. What was that? There was something I had mentioned about, someone on Twitter called out some study I mentioned was maybe not valid. What was that about? And instead of deleting my note on this questionable study, I just added to the note. Some people questioned this study. Basically it was that. So that note gained in value, and I deleted this section and sliced that section. However, if you did want to keep the original note, then yeah, do that same thing. Just append it with you know, a version thing. I might use something like A01, B01, and yeah, there you go. What do you do about being too lazy to write down interesting ideas you come across? Hey, that's really the beauty here. So back in the LYT Kit, all I have to do, hotkey Command N or Control N, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, new idea, okay. And then I hit it again and say, new idea 2, and say, you know, I'm lazy, but come back to this. And then I can give it, you know, some sort of, I use boat, which is like this thing, but I could also just say seed. And then I have a couple avenues back, or I can also append it and add TK here, which means to come. All I'm doing is giving me a way to access this again. You can use whatever tag tells you that, you know, you can then search it and be like, okay, these are the notes that I need to work on. Or you're in, let's keep going with this, or you're in new, just see, new idea. You're in this new idea. And as you're typing along, you come across a concept while you're typing, but you're too lazy too lazy or too occupied to work on it. So I just say new idea 4, but I don't have to create it. So then in this graph view, you can see that it's a different color, which is just a little bit of CSS magic. And I can see, oh, this is an idea that I need to get to because it's not created, but I linked to it. So there you go.